In this video, we're going to be talking about a little debate between the embryologist and cell biologist Jonathan Wells, who wrote the book Icons of Evolution, Science or Myth, Why Much of What We Teach About Evolution is Wrong, and the pro-Darwin lobbyist group, the National Center for Science Education, whose stated goal is to keep evolution in the science classroom and to keep creationism out. Now, today in this video, we're going to be focusing on just icon number 4, Haeckel's embryos. As you can imagine, in Icons of Evolution, there was a series of quote-unquote evidences for evolution that modern high school biology textbooks have used, but they've actually misrepresented the evidence according to the scientist Jonathan Wells. Now, according to the National Center for Science Education, at least on this one issue, Jonathan Wells isn't quite giving the whole story. And we're going to find out today who is telling the truth and who is not on this matter. We're going to take a look at icon number 4, which is part of a series of articles that the National Center for Science Education wrote in response to Jonathan Wells, and we're going to find out how well do their criticisms hold up to his book, and how well does his book hold up to their criticisms. First, however, let's give you a bit of a background. As you can see, Haeckel's embryos start out with embryos that look very, very similar, and the differences only arise later on. Now, if we take this early row of embryos and we compare them to actual photographs, we have a problem, because when we compare these to photographs, which were taken by a biologist by the name of Richardson, the Haeckel's embryos look absolutely nothing like the actual photographed embryos. So, unfortunately, according to Wells, these embryos have still been used in modern-day textbooks, even though we know them to be false. Now remember the name Richardson, because his name is going to come up again later on. Now listen to this quote from the National Center for Science Education. Wells implies that textbooks misrepresent the study of developmental programs as evidence for evolution by accusing them of using Haeckel's inaccurate drawings, in effect accusing textbooks that show any embryos of mindlessly repeating Haeckel. The important question is whether textbooks, and more importantly developmental biologists, still rely on Haeckel's work. The answer is no, but that doesn't stop Wells as acting if they do. Now obviously, the most important aspect of Jonathan Wells' book and the debate with the National Center for Science Education is whether or not Haeckel's embryos have ever actually been used in modern-day textbooks, and if so, how widespread were they? Now, I'm going to make a future video where I'm going to focus on just this issue. I've taken the time to order some of the textbooks that have allegedly used Haeckel's embryos, and of course the National Center for Science Education has said that, well, Haeckel's embryos were used a couple times, but they weren't used to show evidence for evolution. They were just used as more of a historical background to mention that, hey, these are Haeckel's drawings, had some historical significance, but biologists no longer rely on these. Now, somebody in this is lying. Somebody in this is not exactly telling the truth. Either Jonathan Wells, the embryologist who wrote Icons of Evolution, is telling the truth and Haeckel's embryos have been used in modern-day textbooks, or the National Center for Science Education is telling the truth and Haeckel's embryos were maybe used a few times, but not as evidence for evolution, just as a historical backdrop, and it was made very, very clear that Haeckel's embryos are not to be relied upon. This was just included in the textbook for a historical note. Now, moving on. Here's another quote by the National Center for Science Education. Wells' entire chapter on embryology amounts to little more than a misreading of Darwin, Haeckel, and others, combined with a general failure to acknowledge recent work on Haeckel and his embryos by Gould, Richardson, and others. Now this is a very interesting quote because I decided to go and get 2 articles on this topic. One is by Gould and the other one is by Richardson. And now here's the big question. Does Wells' book contradict the work of Gould and Richardson? And, well, let me read you a few quotes and you can decide for yourself. The article by Richardson is entitled, "There is no highly conserved embryonic stage in the vertebrates. Implications for current theories of evolution and development." And I think the most important thing that he said in this article was this. Another point to emerge from the study is the considerable inaccuracy of Haeckel's famous figures. These drawings are still widely reproduced in textbooks and review articles, and continued to exert a significant influence on the development of ideas in this field. And then he goes on to cite articles that showed this. Now, this is quite significant because, according to Richardson, at the time that he wrote this article, these embryos were still being widely used in textbooks. National Center for Science Education says that they weren't there, but according to Richardson, who the National Center for Education cites, yeah, these embryos have been widely used in textbooks. And according to Richardson, this is also interesting because not only have they been widely used in textbooks, but Haeckel's embryos have influenced research in the field of embryonic development. So even though these drawings were a hoax, they were still influencing the mindset of embryologists, and not in a good way, according to Richardson. Now, I highly recommend this article. It's called, like I said, it's called "There is no highly conserved embryonic stage in the vertebrates: Implications for Current Theories of Evolution and Development." If you read this article, it directly contradicts what the National Center for Science Education had to say, but it lines up perfectly with what Jonathan Wells had to say in his book. Now, I'm not claiming that Richardson agrees with Jonathan Wells' intelligent design viewpoints. It would seem that Richardson is more mainstream in his views on things in that area. However, Richardson's facts about embryology lined up perfectly with Jonathan Wells' book. However, they didn't line up with what the National Center for Science Education had to say about embryology in this article. Now, onto the article by Gould. The article by Stephen Jay Gould, and for those of you who don't know, if there was a controversy in science, it was always good to read what Gould had to say. He has since passed away, unfortunately, because Stephen Jay Gould always had something interesting to say about anything, whether you agreed with him or not. And creationists, even young Earth creationists, actually had a lot of respect for him. Now, the article is entitled "Atrocious," but the title is more of a German title. It says "Abschalik." I don't know. See, this is what I gotta learn to pretend to speak German so that I could ignore people on the street, and because hey, I could pretend I don't speak English and pretend I only speak German, and people leave me alone. But anyway, the article is this is what the article is. It was published in Natural History, and it is called "Atrocious" in German. And the quote by Stephen Jay Gould is this. Basically, Stephen Jay Gould had contacted one of his colleagues, and his colleague on the issue of Haeckel's embryos, and his colleague had contacted him back, and what Gould had to say was this: "We should therefore not be surprised that Haeckel's drawings entered 19th century textbooks, but we do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed of the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not a majority, of modern textbooks." Michael Richardson of the St. George's Hospital Medical School in London, a colleague who deserves nothing but praise for directing attention to this old issue, wrote to me, letter of August 16, 1999, "If so many historians knew all about the old controversy over Haeckel's falsified drawings, then why did they not communicate this information to the numerous contemporary authors who use the Haeckel drawings in their books? I know of at least 50 recent biology texts which use the drawings uncritically. I think this is the most important question to come out of the whole story." Now, the National Center for Science Education has accused Jonathan Wells of not keeping up with the work of Gould and Richardson, but it would seem that the shoe is on the other foot, because according to Stephen Jay Gould and according to Richardson, Haeckel's embryos have not only been widely used in modern-day textbooks, but they also have been influential in modern-day embryology. So it would seem that Jonathan Wells is right on this issue, and the National Center for Science Education is wrong, because, well, Gould and Richardson are agreeing with Jonathan Wells and disagreeing with the National Center for Science Education. Now, of course, perhaps Jonathan Wells, Stephen Jay Gould, and Richardson are all mistaken on the matter, and perhaps the National Center for Science Education is telling the truth. Perhaps Haeckel's embryos have never actually been widely used in modern-day textbooks. Stay tuned to this channel, because We're going to find out for sure in a future video. I have ordered several old textbooks that have supposedly used Haeckel's embryos as evidence for evolution. Now these textbooks are from like the 1990s. They're from the time period that Wells, Richardson, and Gould were all writing. So we're going to be able to open these textbooks that have been cited as supposedly showing Haeckel's embryos as evidence for evolution, and we're going to find out for sure what do they have to say about Haeckel's embryos. Have they used them as just a historical reference to say, hey, this is something that people used to believe, or have they inappropriately used these as factual evidence to show to students to say, hey, we evolved from slime mold in our distant past, and you are related to that monkey, that lizard, that turtle, and that tomato plant. Stay tuned to greenslug.com and find out for sure. Now here's another interesting thing the National Center for Science Education had to say. When quoting both Darwin and other historical figures, he meaning Jonathan Wells, quotes them out of context, leaves out important parts of quotes, and even changes the order of their appearance, all to misrepresent their real meaning and intent. Now, in this article, the National Center for Science Education makes a lot of general claims like this. However, for example, with this claim, they don't give any examples. They just make this large claim against Jonathan Wells without really backing it up. This is something you have to watch out for in any article or any time you're having a controversy. Sometimes people will make these giant, wide accusations, or they'll make these very large claims without really backing them up. Now, obviously, you can only back things up so far. However, a few quotes of Jonathan Wells' paragraphs would have been interesting. However, they don't do that. They just make, the National Center for Science Education just makes these wide sweeping claims, and they do this repeatedly throughout this article. They make these large, wide sweeping claims, and they don't really back them up. They'll say, well, Wells said this, and Wells says that, and Wells thinks this, and Wells thinks that, but they don't really back these up with quotes very often. They just make these general, wide sweeping claims, and I'm like, really? Where did he say that? And this is an important thing to remember in any controversy, so keep your eyes open, and remember, stick to the facts. If somebody isn't willing to back something up with facts, you should question, how valid is this claim? Now, the rest of the paragraph where they said this basically accuses Wells of being against embryology and against comparative embryology. However, the last sentence says, Wells should know better as the holder of a PhD in cell and developmental biology. Now, of course, they make these wide sweeping claims, and then they're attacking him saying that he should know better, but they don't really back up their accusations that he's making these claims to begin with. So you have to really question, is what the National Center for Science Education having to say, does it line up with what Jonathan Wells actually said in his book? And since I've read this chapter twice, I can say, no, it isn't. Here's another quote from the National Center for Science Education. Wells's treatment of comparative embryology is remarkably limited. For example, he never discusses invertebrate development. And of course, then the question arises, why would he? He's talking about Haeckel's embryos, which dealt only with vertebrate development, not with invertebrate development. So the question arises, why would he talk about this? This is kind of a irrelevant criticism. This has nothing to do with the context of the chapter. This would be like me writing a paper on dinosaurs and somebody criticizing me for not talking about the African elephant. Why would I talk about the African elephant when it has nothing to do with Tyrannosaurus rex? Come on. Basically, some of these criticisms just don't make any sense at all, and it shows that the National Center for Science Education doesn't really have a leg to stand on. Now, according to the National Center for Science Education, finally, Wells concludes by attacking prominent biologists such as Gould and Futuyma for supposedly not knowing the truth about Haeckel, saying that this is, quote, a confession of ignorance not likely to inspire confidence in the quality of our biology textbooks. Now, for those of you who don't know, Futuyma is a textbook author, and here's one of his textbooks, and this will actually be used in the future video of Haeckel's embryos that I mentioned earlier. And Stephen Jay Gould was the greatest paleontologist of the 20th century, and creationists, like I said, have a lot of respect for him. Kurt Wise, the creation paleontologist at the Creation Museum built by Answers in Genesis, studied under him at Harvard. And so basically, what did Jonathan Wells actually say about Futuyma and Gould? According to Jonathan Wells, Futuyma said that he was unaware of the fact that Haeckel's embryos were actually a hoax from the 1860s until somebody in a public forum online pointed it out to him. And according to Jonathan Wells, Stephen Jay Gould said that he already knew that it was a hoax, and he had known for 20 years. Jonathan Wells did not say that Gould had been ignorant on the matter. According to Wells, Gould had known for 20 years, but had not been willing to kind of talk about it the way he should have. According to Wells, Stephen Jay Gould should have contacted the textbook authors and said, hey, this is you actually have this major inaccuracy in your textbook, because according to Stephen Jay Gould, putting Haeckel's embryos in the textbooks was the intellectual equivalent of murder. Now, if this is the intellectual equivalent of murder, and you're keeping your mouth shut and watching it happen, then what does that make you? That would make you an accessory to murder. Those are my words, not Wells on the matter. But Wells, according to Wells, it's like, hey, if you knew these were in the textbooks, and according to you, this is the intellectual equivalent of murder, why were you keeping your mouth shut on the matter? And he also criticizes both Futuyma and Gould for attacking quote-unquote creationists on the matter when Futuyma and Gould accused the person who pointed out the error to Futuyma of being a creationist. Now, the person who pointed this out was actually a fellow biologist, so accusing him of just saying, well, this is an evil creationist, and we're going to go turn around and attack creationists on the matter. I mean, come on, it was actually a creationist that pointed out the error in your textbook to you, so why are you attacking creationists on the matter? In a nutshell with that one, according to Jonathan Wells, Futuyma, the textbook author, was unaware that Haeckel's embryos were false until it was pointed out to him by a quote-unquote creationist. But Gould knew that Haeckel's embryos were false, but he kept his mouth shut for 20 years anyway. So that's basically what Wells had to say on the matter. Now, the problem is not that Stephen Jay Gould didn't mention the matter at all. Nobody's denying that Stephen Jay Gould has mentioned it in some of his publications. However, the problem is that Stephen Jay Gould could have taken the time and either given a phone call to some of the publishers, or he could have taken an hour and written an email, or he could have written a letter and made photocopies and had his secretary send them out to the appropriate parties, and within a couple hours max of Stephen Jay Gould's time, the problem could have been solved. So we wouldn't have had this quote-unquote intellectual equivalent of murder. So we wouldn't have generations and generations and millions and millions and millions of students who have read these textbooks falsely thinking that Haeckel's embryos represented actual science. So that was the problem. It was not that Stephen Jay Gould didn't mention them at all. It was that he really was mentioning them kind of more passively than anything else. And of course, this is my words, not Wells. I'm just putting things to my own words here. Now, here's an interesting quote, and this is part of two that kind of went along with each other. Even if Wells were right about Haeckel's work and Darwin's use of it, what Haeckel and Darwin thought doesn't matter. Embryology has moved beyond them. Wells needs to show a lack of specific similarities to support his case. Is Wells actually claiming that there are no shared features in development at all? That a chicken gets a planula while a duck gets a nauplius? If so, he needs to show it. But Wells never gets to specifics, apparently because the specifics aren't there. Keep listening. Innuendo and accusations of fraud do not cut it in science. Now, of course, as I have read to you from this article, most of this article was basically innuendo and accusation of fraud. This article very much lacked on the factual aspects of things. So if innuendo and accusations of fraud do not cut it in science, then this article doesn't cut it in science also because, well, they had quite a few personal character assassinations against Jonathan Wells and lots of innuendo, including in this quote. Even in this quote that I just quoted, even if Wells were right about Haeckel and Darwin's blah blah blah, Is Wells actually claiming that there are no shared features in development at all, that a chicken gets a planula while a duck gets a naupius? If so, he needs to show it, but Wells never gets to specifics, etc., etc., etc. Now, if that's not innuendo, then I don't know what is, because they're making innuendo and insinuating that Wells is claiming that there are no shared features at all in embryology, and of course, no, Wells is not making this claim at all. The only people, it's the National Center for Science Education is putting words into Jonathan Wells' mouth. Jonathan Wells has never made the claim that there are no shared similarities between embryos. That's not the case he's making at all. Go and read as I said in my other videos, go and read the book. Wells has never made this claim at all. You're putting words into his mouth. And if you have to do this, if you have to have innuendo and accusation of fraud against Jonathan Wells, then that makes me question how strong your case actually is and what your motives really are. Now, of course, their other point in this paragraph was that Wells lacked in his specifics in his treatment of embryology. But actually, when I read Jonathan Wells' book, I actually learned a lot about embryology, and it actually quite satisfied me as a biology student. Like I said before, I'm going for a biotechnology degree. This coming year will be my 4th year of studies. I will be a senior next year. So for me to look at a book and be very, very happy with the level of biological detail really says something. I was wanting to learn a lot about embryology that I didn't know before, and even if Jonathan Wells didn't have this whole controversy going on, even if he wasn't talking about the problems with evolution in the textbooks, then I would still be quite happy because I learned a lot about the detail of embryology that I didn't know before, and it taught me quite a great deal and edified me as a biology student. This accusation that he was lacking in detail and that he didn't give examples to back up his case is just patently false. I mean, it's not true at all. I mean, this almost makes me, I mean, this is a lie. This is a baseless claim with nothing to back it up. Jonathan Wells was very, very detailed in his treatment of embryology, being an embryologist, and I learned a lot as a result. So, now this next quote is similar to the previous one. Does Wells assert that they have no features in common? If so, he should document it. And of course, no, he's not making that claim at all. Go read the book. Having failed to do this, Wells merely labels anything he does not like misleading. Wells also takes exception to the colloquial term gill slits, which is a commonly used non-technical term for pharyngeal pouches. Wells implies that by using this term, biologists and textbooks are saying that all animals' embryos have gills. This is patently false. No textbook reviewed even implies the presence of gills in embryos. The question is what these structures are and what they become, not what they are called. Using the terms gill slits automatically results in a C, even if the textbook contains no images and regardless of its content. Now, this is interesting because, obviously, they're putting words into Jonathan Wells' mouth that aren't there, accusing him of denying that embryos have any similarities at all. And also, according to the National Center for Science Education, if a textbook uses the term gill slits, that doesn't imply gills. Why would anybody think gills when you say gill slits? If you say gill slits to somebody, they'd have to be crazy to think gills. I mean, those are two totally separate things entirely. I mean, come on. If you tell a high school biology student that human embryos have gill slits, what is the first thing they're going to think of? Gills. They're going to think you're talking about gills. They're going to think you're talking about fishy gills so that the embryos can breathe underwater. That's what they're going to think you're talking about. However, at this stage where human beings supposedly have gill slits, we don't have gill slits. We have pharyngeal arches or pharyngeal pouches. They're called two different things. And these aren't useless leftovers from evolution. And in fact, fish don't even have gills at this stage. At this stage, these pharyngeal arches are being used to help develop parts of the throat in basically different parts of the body in this region. So they're actually used in embryonic development. And even in fish, not all of these pharyngeal arches are used to develop in gills. So to call them gill slits is really to take evolutionary belief and push that on the evidence. It's really recycling the interpretation, recycling the belief back onto the evidence and giving the students the false impression that embryos have gills. It would be more appropriate and a lot less misleading for textbooks to use terms like pharyngeal pouches or pharyngeal arches and explain, actually they should actually explain to students that these aren't really gills, even though that's the common misconception. There's a misconception here, yes, and it's because textbooks are being misleading on the matter. They're saying gill slits, and guess what? That implies gills, as much as the National Center for Science Education would try to say otherwise. Now, one of the last sections of this article says why we should still teach comparative embryology, and basically they've implied throughout the article that Jonathan Wells is against teaching comparative embryology, which is of course not the case. He's not against comparative embryology. He's not against teaching comparative embryology. He himself is an embryologist. Come on, get it through your head. Now, one of the very last sentences in this says, "There is no reason to let their baseless complaints and character assassination dissuade biology teachers from presenting the evidence to students." And honestly, I think that pointing out that we are still using hoaxes from the 1860s and teaching them to students as fact, I don't think that's a baseless complaint. I think that if textbooks are using Haeckel's embryos, which are a hoax from the 1860s, to teach embryology to students and to use this as evidence for evolution, I don't think that's a baseless complaint. And honestly, Wells isn't the one doing character assassinations here. As the National Center for Science Education said in this article, "Innuendo and accusation of fraud do not cut it in science." Alright, I have just one more quote from this National Center for Science Education article on this matter. "Finally, a plain reading of Darwin shows that he was suggesting something between 2 and 3. Even though he was not an embryologist, he had a more sophisticated notion of embryology and development than does Wells." And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. You have a baseless complaint and a character assassination. So all this is an ad hominem attack, that's a logical term, meaning that they're attacking the man instead of his argument, which is a logical fallacy. Very commonly we'll hear people say, well, that scientist is a creationist, you can't listen to him. Or in the case of Jonathan Wells, well, he's an intelligent design advocate, you can't listen to him. Or in this case, they're accusing him of being a bad embryologist. Basically what this is they're attacking the person instead of their argument. And the reason is Jonathan Wells' argument holds. When I looked up quotes from Richardson and from Gould, and according to them, Jonathan Wells is right on these matters. They don't agree with him on his intelligent design viewpoints, but on his history and his assessment of the accuracy of Haeckel's embryos and whether or not these are actually used in the textbooks, according to Gould and Richardson, yes, Jonathan Wells is right. They're agreeing with him. Or they wrote before him, so he's agreeing with them. But anyway, that's beside the point. At the end of the day, though, the author of this article, Alan D. Let me look up his pronunciation real quick again. Alan D. Gishlick is not an embryologist. So for him to say that Jonathan Wells has a less sophisticated view of embryology than does Darwin, I mean, he has no basis to say this. He has no authority to say this. Now, if he wants to write an article critiquing what Jonathan Wells had to say about embryology, this, for example, I mean, that's perfectly reasonable. There's nothing wrong with that. However, he has no authority to say that Jonathan Wells is a poor embryologist. This is a baseless complaint. It's a baseless character assassination is what it is. And at the end of the day, these baseless complaints, these baseless character assassinations do not make the cut in science. Now, stay tuned for my future video, which I mentioned before, where I am going to be reviewing these textbooks and find out for sure, I'll find out absolutely for sure, if they have Haeckel's embryos in them, and if so, are they using these in just a historical context, as Gould, Richardson, and Wells all have said, or as the National Center for Science Education had to say, are these just used in 1 or 2 and only in a historical context? Well, you're gonna have to stay tuned to my other videos and find out for sure. Subscribe, comment, rate, and also Feel free to check out my other videos. Feel free to check out my website, which is greenslug.com. And remember, slug is spelled with 2 G's. Shalom. May God bless you all. This is Greg, out.